I'm going to say that again. Thank you, family and friends, for joining me for session number 2 of this year's class on Maimonides. It's really a pleasure to have everyone join what I think is a really important topic. Um, Again, not just because Maimonides is such an immense figure in the Jewish tradition, but because I think the issues that we're going to be discussing, that we've started to discuss already, and that we'll continue today, are really not only foundational to Judaism, but are really integral to our conception of religion more generally and our relationship with God to the extent we want to have one. These issues, I think, are really germane to much of our life and go beyond simply learning about Maimonides. Um, Having said that, let me share my source sheet with you. Okay, so the title of the class, the subtitle was Maimonides, the greatest Jew of all time, or a heretic. Um, I gave it away last session, but I'll say it again for those, just to remind those who were here and for anyone who was not. Um, I think Maimonides was one of the greatest Jews of all time. He's in my top 4 of all time in terms of his significance to the Jewish tradition, to Jewish thought, to Jewish culture. But there were Jews both in his lifetime and in the generations that followed for really a couple of centuries, who considered aspects of his work heretical. We're going to get into more of the controversies next week, focusing on biblical allegory and some of the issues that really were viewed as quite provocative to his fellow Jews and to the Jews in the regions affected by his thinking in the centuries that followed his lifetime. But I want to continue today really to try to explore more of the underlying concepts in Maimonides' thought, both that give rise to his genius and his brilliance on the one hand, and to why they were considered provocative and controversial on the other. So really, I mentioned this sort of paradox last session, but I'm going to reiterate it here again at the threshold of this discussion because it's really going to encompass a lot of what we're talking about today. The paradox of Maimonides, even in his lifetime, being considered a great rabbinic authority, but certainly in the 800 years since he died, he has developed immense prestige and authority connected to his name. The Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, that's how he's referred to in traditional Jewish circles. His stature is enormous in traditional Jewish circles, but I presented him, and I'm going to continue to present him today, as a radical reformer of Jewish life and Jewish thinking. He was trying to recover aspects of Judaism he thought had really been lost and corrupted over time. So he wasn't making up new things. He was trying to renew and reinvigorate Judaism, to recover patterns of thought that he thought had been tainted and lost over time. But he was really a failed radical reformer. So the paradox is, despite his immense prestige, the radical reforms that he tried to instill within Jewish thinking and Jewish practice and Jewish life were largely unsuccessful. And we'll get back to that, the issue of his failed agenda of radical reform. But again, I think we're going to talk about issues that are really cut to the core of Judaism and to the entire enterprise of religion more generally. I want to start my discussion today. These are all the texts that we covered last week, but I'm going to start with one that was near the end of last week's session. So this is the text that I brought from who I think is one of the leading scholars of Maimonidean thought today, Menachem Kellner, who now lives in Israel, about a really interesting article about traditional Jewish thinkers who've sort of amended Maimonides to make him conform, um, to have him be more in line with their own thinking. But this, I think, is the most provocative statement about the radical nature of Maimonides' thought. Kellner in that article writes, and again, we covered this last week, but I'm going to tease out some of the implications this week. Kellner wrote, Israel's election, meaning as the chosen people, is the result of a historical accident, plain and simple. It was Abraham the Hebrew who discovered God. Had a Navajo Indian been the first person to discover God following the decline in humanity after the generation of Adam's grandson Enosh, that person's tribe would have become the chosen people. The Torah would have been given in the Navajo language. The historical parts of the Torah would have dealt with Navajo history, and the Promised Land presumably would have been in Nevada. Now, I hope that sounds radical to you. If you study Jewish thought, the idea that it was sort of a matter of historical contingency, almost happenstance, that we became the chosen people just because our ancestor Abraham happened to be the first person who discovered God, who discovered monotheism, that's a radical notion. And the idea that the promised land could have been elsewhere, our holy tongue, the Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew could have been a different language. Everything essentially about the Torah could have been different, is, I think, an upshot of Maimonides' thought, but really represents quite a radical notion. And again, I want to tease out some of the counter-traditional implications of Maimonides' thought that we will see play out in the text that I will discuss today and in the final two sessions as well. So I've listed them here. I'm not going to discuss them all in detail right now. We're going to see them, I think, materialize in the course of the text that we will discuss. The first is that Abraham chose God, not the other way around. Again, all of these cut against the grain of traditional Jewish thought, that the correct knowledge of God is accessible to all people. Notably, Abraham, as presented in Genesis, was a non-Jew. He wasn't born a Jew. He was a non-Jew, an unconverted Gentile, who discovered the truth about monotheism and about the Jewish God and the God of the entire universe. So being God's chosen people was not predetermined, and the details of the Torah are not historically inevitable. Again, all of these statements, these implications, I think, are fair inferences from Maimonides' thoughts. Some of these he says explicitly, others I think can be drawn out quite fairly, but these are all not mainstream. The Torah's commandments, all of the mitzvot, are not divinely preordained. The Hebrew language, even if we've attributed holiness to it through the system of religious life that we live, it's not inherently holy in a way that is distinct from other languages. Israel, as Kellner suggests, was not predestined to be the promised land, and therefore, importantly, the land of Israel itself is also not intrinsically or inherently holy.
How are you?
If everyone can mute themselves, please. We attach holiness to the
my God.
but it is not ontologically holy. And importantly, holiness for us, I brought the text from Leviticus, Kedoshim to you, that you shall be holy, that Maimonides believed that should not be read as some assurance or guarantee of holiness, but rather that holiness is a hard-earned state of humanity. We have to work for it. It's earned and not guaranteed. And it's the result only of proper both conduct and thought. Maimonides certainly believed that Jews were obligated to perform the hundreds, the thousands of biblical and rabbinic commandments. But in addition, he believed that we had to reach Jews, and everyone else had access to the same entitlement to reach certain properly informed convictions about the world and about God. And therefore, as a result, the entire upshot, which is quite untraditional in terms of mainstream Jewish thought, is that the divine revelation embodied in the Torah could have been radically different. Again, everything, all of these bullet points are non-traditional, but I do believe fair and reasonable inferences from Maimonides' thought. Okay, I want to move to a sort of threshold issue that I think may be the most interesting thing I conveyed to you today, and it's really very basic. Um, and it really is an issue that plagues or presents a challenge to Jewish thought more generally. So both with respect to Maimonidean thought and to the countervailing patterns of thought in mainstream Judaism. And that challenge being, how do we conceive of God properly? Recall that, for example, in our High Holy Day liturgy, we refer to God as Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. Those are not necessarily consistent conceptions of God. They go sort of hand in hand liturgically, and we say them perhaps quite casually without putting enough thought into what that means. How do we approach God as both parent and as king? And this point, some of you may have noticed this previously, but I think it's a really fundamental point about how we as Jews approach God and approach our religion more generally. Every bracha, every blessing we say, that is the sort of the full version of the bracha, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Lord our God, Eloheinu melech haolam, King of the universe, asher kiddushanu bemitzvotav. And then we continue with whatever language is that's relevant to what we're about to do. But notice that there's a grammatical pivot here. We pivot from the second person, blessed are you, God, who sanctified us with his commandments. What would one assume it should be if it continued in the second person grammatically? It would be Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotecha. It doesn't say that. We switch grammatically. We switch in sort of our approach from a sort of Avinu mentality, a closeness, an immanence in God's relationship to us and our relationship to God, to a more transcendent one, to a more Malkeinu perspective. We refer to God in the third person. Again, all of this is within a matter of words in almost every bracha, or every blessing we say. And that grammatical pivot, I think, really embodies this challenge. How do we sort of swing between those two ends of the spectrum, treating God as immanent, as close, as parent, and also at the same time as transcendent, as king-like, as sort of third person in terms of our relationship with God? And I will suggest that Maimonides is more on the transcendent end of the spectrum. I will say, and we've seen this already, Maimonides' notion of God is not particularly warm and fuzzy. That's not the way Maimonides saw God as an extremely immanent force in the universe. He's more on the transcendent end of the spectrum. And the countervailing, what I'll call the sort of Kabbalistic forces or patterns of thought in the Jewish tradition are more on the immanent side. That they develop a closeness to God that is more comforting, frankly, than Maimonidean thought. But on the other hand, Maimonides believed were not correct and true conceptions of God. So after that sort of threshold issue, let's see how this plays out in competing openings to great legal codes in the Jewish tradition. We'll start with Maimonides, the Rambam. This is a text that I brought in the first session too, but let's return to it so we can view it in this perspective. This is how Maimonides opens his great code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah. We'll get back to the Mishnah Torah, but again, it was the Mishnah Torah itself is the most traditional of Maimonides' texts.
Is this level of sound fine?
Sam, can we mute that, please? Sheila. But so this is the most traditional of Maimonides' texts, but it is quite innovative, quite radical right at its beginning. We read this last time. The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence. All the beings of the heaven, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his being. So Maimonides begins his great legal code with and this, by the way, is also the first commandment that he lists in his Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Commandments. It is our first obligation to figure out for ourselves and to deduce philosophically and logically and spiritually that God is the primary cause of everything in reality. So Maimonides starts out with an informed belief that is essentially the first law that he addresses in his great code of law, the Mishnah Torah. On the other hand, Rav Yosef Karo, several centuries later, who was himself building on not only the Mishnah Torah, but also the Arba Turim, another intervening legal code, he starts out his great code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, much differently. In the Hebrew, a famous line, and it's a beautiful line, Yitgaber ka'ari la'amod baboker la'avodat bor'o sheyehehu me'orer hashachar. One should strengthen oneself like a lion to get up in the morning to serve his creator so that it is he who awakens the dawn. So really much differently, Rav Yosef Karo's great legal code, the Shulchan Aruch, starts out with sort of practice. It's not informed belief that should be the focus of our initial relationship with God, but we should have enthusiastic, we should have alacrity getting up in the morning to engage in all the behavior. So this is performance, conduct, behavior-based service of God. We should have great energy every morning to serve God through all the various commandments. And again, Maimonides, in contrast, starts, well, the first commandment is to have true and correct understanding of God before we get to all the sort of practical commandment details. Let's continue this idea that I broached last time about Maimonides' what I'm calling universalistic approach to knowledge of God. So the Maimonides had, if you look at sort of two axes, it's really more of a horizontal axis that he viewed everyone in the world really having potential access to proper knowledge of God, to having the right kind of relationship with God. It wasn't exclusive to Jews. On the other hand, it wasn't particularly vertical in sort of style, because Maimonides believed that only a very small subset of people generally, and certainly of Jews, could achieve the right kind of knowledge of God. But the underlying principles for Maimonides in this approach, which imply very clearly that it was available and accessible to all human beings, not just Jews, is he wrote in his great philosophical work, The Guide to the Perplexed, being a rational animal is the essence and true reality of man. For people, it's the being of which life and rationality are predicated. So reason is the essence of what we are as human beings. That is the sort of underlying principle, and it goes hand in hand with Maimonides' view that, as Genesis teaches us, we were all created in the image of God, not just Jews. All humanity shares that in common, and therefore all human beings have this rational capacity to try to understand the world and understand God as best as we are able. This is a principle, underlying principle, that Maimonides preaches throughout his writings. And it is really this capacity to know God intellectually that distinguishes us from other creatures in the world. Continuing, again, back to his legal code, which is distinctive and innovative because Maimonides includes various philosophical principles in his legal code, which is not found in comparable later codes, including the Shulchan Aruch. In the section Foundations of the Torah, Maimonides writes, and what is the way that will lead to the love of God and the fear of God? When a person contemplates his great and wondrous works and creatures, and from them obtains a glimpse of God's wisdom, which is incomparable and infinite, so the person who gains that level will straightway love God, praise God, glorify God, and long with an exceeding longing to know God's great name. And then quotes, that's what King David did, or King David expressed in Psalm 42. So again, returning to something I tried to convey in the first session from Maimonides, the study of science, the study of physics and metaphysics, so the study of the natural world and the study of divine attributes is how we can develop the proper knowledge and love of God that Maimonides wants to instill in his readers. So, essentially, he's presenting King David here as sort of a medieval Aristotelian philosopher that King David endorses through Maimonides' use of this proof text. He's trying to imply that King David was the kind of great philosopher that Maimonides is trying to encourage his fellow Jews to become as well. But importantly, that sort of ultimate religious and spiritual achievement is accessible to all human beings. It's a universalistic mandate and obligation and opportunity that is not confined to Jews. So let's see how that plays out in what I think is a series of really intriguing texts that display Maimonides' universalistic attitude about Judaism, about God, and about the shared humanity that we have in common with all human beings. This passage from the Mishnah Torah, I will note, comes at the exact midpoint of the Mishnah Torah. It's right in the middle of his great code of Jewish law, which is probably not coincidental. I think that it represents something that was quite important to Maimonides. Maimonides is saying sort of this is in the middle of everything that I'm trying to talk about. I think very little that Maimonides did was inadvertent or accidental. And I think it was purposeful that he wrote this really important and compelling statement right in the middle of the Mishnah Torah. He wrote, not only the tribe of Levi, but each and every individual human being. I've highlighted the phrases that I want you to focus on in the Hebrew, elakol ish ve'ish mikol ba'ei ha'olam. So the phrase there in Hebrew, for the Hebrew readers and speakers, kol ba'ei olam is the phrase that I want you to focus on, that I will show here in this series of texts that indisputably, that certainly goes beyond the Jewish community. So Maimonides is saying not only the tribe of Levi, but everyone whose spirit moves him and whose knowledge gives him understanding to set himself. And I know all of these pronouns are in the male. That's how translations work. But in addition, that may be how Maimonides thought of it. But we can think of it as gender neutral. So to set oneself apart in order to stand before the Lord, to serve God, to worship God, and to know him, who walks upright as God created one to do, and releases oneself from the yoke of the many foolish considerations which trouble people. Such an individual, and again, harei zeh, not confined to Jews, and listen to the power of this statement, is as consecrated as the Holy of Holies. Harei zeh nitkadesh kodesh kodashim, and his portion and inheritance shall be in the Lord forever and ever. V'yiyeh Hashem chalko v'nachalato le'olam ul'olmei olamim. The Lord will grant him adequate sustenance in this world, the same as he had granted to the priests and to the Levites. So Maimonides is saying, just like the Leviim, the Levites had and the Kohanim, the priests had a special place in sort of Jewish society in biblical times. So too, the people who reach certain heights of understanding of God and a relationship with God, again, not just Jews, but all humans who reach that, have a certain holiness attached to them, and they essentially will be sort of partners with God forever. And what does that mean? This phrase, Vehi Hashem chalko v'nachlato leolam ulolmei olamim, almost certainly within the scheme of Maimonidean thought, means they will have a share in the world to come, in olam haba. And this is radical just in and of itself. I want to try to convey how different this is from mainstream Judaism. This is saying that non-Jews, unconverted Gentiles who reach a certain spiritual and intellectual height in their relationship with God will have a share in the world to come, perhaps more so than Jews who fail to achieve those same spiritual heights. So this phrase, kol ba'ei olam, I'm going to show you the sort of pedigree of that phrase that Maimonides is drawing on, that I think proves, that demonstrates this is not confined to Judaism. This is not an exclusive domain of Jewish achievement, but in fact, it is accessible as an opportunity to non-Jews as well. So as part of this sort of pedigree of this idea, this universalistic idea, I'm going to include several important passages from various sources. The first one, I hope you recognize, is from the prayer that we recite both on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Unetane Tokef Piyut, this liturgical poem that is perhaps the climactic point in our high holiday liturgy every year. We say, we acclaim this day's pure sanctity, its awesome power. This day, Lord, your dominion is deeply felt. Compassion and truth, its foundations are perceived. And what do we call Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment? In truth, do you, God, judge and prosecute, discern motives and bear witness, record and seal, count and measure, remembering all that we have forgotten, and all who exist in the world pass before you as a flock of sheep. Look at the Hebrew. V'chol ba'ei olam ya'avrun lefanecha kivnei maron. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but when we say Unetane Tokef, we, I believe, are reciting a prayer that is universal in nature. It's not peculiarly or particularistically Jewish. We're referring to God's judgment of all creatures on earth on this day of judgment, on Rosh Hashanah. And like a shepherd who gathers his flock, bringing them under his staff, you, God, bring everything that lives before you for review. You determine the life and decree the destiny of every creature. L'chol bria. So, Unetane Tokef, I think, is a powerful universalistic liturgical poem that many of us may think of it in sort of peculiarly Jewish terms, that it's sort of insular in nature, but it really is conveying the idea that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment for the entire world, not just for Jews. So we Jews, we have the advantage because we know to go through this phase of repentance, of tshuva leading up to it, maybe that other non-Jews aren't aware of, but that this day is, Rosh Hashanah is really a day of judgment for all Jews, for all people of the world, and not just only for Jews. And what is the source for Unetane Tokef's use of that universalistic phrase? It's the Mishnah, Tractate Rosh Hashanah. So Unetane Tokef, by the way, the exact dating of that prayer is not precise. Maimonides may or may not have been aware of Unetane Tokef. It sort of was, I think scholars believe, was created probably before Maimonides' time, but it's not clear that it circulated sufficiently, at least then, for Maimonides to be aware of it. So he may or may not have been drawing a parallel. But certainly, both he and the author of Unetane Tokef were aware of this, this pre-existing rabbinic source from the Mishnah, which preceded both Maimonides and Unetane Tokef by many centuries. The Mishnah there says, at 4 set times the world is judged by God, on Passover, on Shavuot, and then on Rosh Hashanah, all who exist in the world pass before him like a flock of sheep. So again, this is where this language originates. Berosh Hashanah kol ba'ei ha'olam ovrin lefanav kivnei maron. And then it says, as it says, he who fashions the hearts of them all who discerns all their doings. And then it also references Sukkot at the end. But I want you to focus on Rosh Hashanah being a day of universal judgment, not of particularistic judgment of Jews alone, but of God's judgment of the entire world. And again, I'm trying to trace the intellectual history of this idea that God on Rosh Hashanah judges everyone, and not just Jews. And therefore, the upshot is all people have the opportunity to develop a relationship with God and to develop true and correct religious convictions about God. You see here that this Mishnah cites Psalm 33. So I brought you Psalm 33 to show you that in the original setting, this, of course, is attributed by tradition to King David. Psalm 33 says, "The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all mankind. Ra'ah et kol b'nei ha'adam." It doesn't just say he sees the Jews, but it says God sees all mankind. From his dwelling place, he looks upon all the inhabitants of the earth. Mimchon shivto hishkiach el kol yoshvei haaretz. He fashions their hearts alike. He considers all their deeds. This is the line that is cited in the Mishnah itself, but I wanted to provide the broader context, a few additional verses from Psalm 33, which indicate very clearly its universalistic purview. And it's the pedigree of this idea that gives rise to Maimonides, his notion. Let's just go back to that from in the Mishnah Torah, that it's not just Leviim who have a special relationship with God, but every person, every human being who achieves a certain spiritual and intellectual relationship with God, that individual, whether Jew or non-Jew, is consecrated as much as the Holy of Holies in the temple and achieves a share of the world to come. That's a radical notion. That's not a particularly mainstream traditional view. I would even say it's a minority view within the Jewish tradition, but Maimonides draws upon it. And by Maimonides doing that, he makes it more authoritative, more of a viable option within the sort of spectrum of Jewish traditional thought. However, getting back to the paradox of Maimonides being an immensely influential thinker within the Jewish tradition, again, on my Mount Rushmore of Jews, he was really a failed reformer, as I've mentioned. Rav Aharon Kotler, who perhaps was the leading ultra-Orthodox rabbinic figure of the 20th century in America. He was born in Europe, but immigrated to the United States, became a very important ultra-Orthodox thinker and figure, authoritative rabbinic figure in the yeshiva world, established what has become a huge yeshiva in New Jersey. But he was really a towering figure in the ultra-Orthodox community. Listen to how he interprets, and I would say misinterprets, not necessarily purposefully, but he sort of conforms Maimonides to what he thinks Maimonides must have meant. And I think he didn't properly understand Maimonides. Rav Aaron Kotler, the commentary on the passage that we've looked at from the Mishnah Torah about all human beings potentially being holy and endeared to God forever, he wrote, "Those people are most assuredly the Torah scholars of the generation who are exclusively devoted to Torah." And by the way, what he means by that are the types of students that he developed in America of Kollel yeshiva scholars, people who study Talmud, mostly Talmud, exclusively, and are actually sponsored by the community. Rav Aaron Kotler is saying, oh, by the way, the people that I have raised up as great Torah scholars, they're the ones that the mighty Rambam had in mind as being holy and endeared to God forever. And Rav Aaron Kotler continues and uses very, very cleverly a proof text from the Babylonian Talmud. He says, since the day that the temple was destroyed, the Holy One, blessed be he, has nothing in this world but the 4 cubits of halacha, Jewish law alone. So he's saying, well, since the destruction of the temple, all God really has left in the world is halacha, which is the focus of the study of these Torah scholars that Rav Aaron Kotler is referring to. And so that's God's portion, and that's also the portion that these Torah scholars share in union with God. And he writes that this sort of exclusive Torah devotion, again with a almost virtually exclusive focus on Talmudic study, this is in place of the temple service and of tending to the needs of the temple, which have been done by the Levites. And I've mentioned this, but the Levites, if you recall, in both the Torah and in Rabbinic Judaism, were sponsored by other Jews. They were given, they were supported financially by other Jews. So this is really an incredible reinterpretation of Maimonides, again, in a way that displays not necessarily that Rav Aaron Kotler was trying to misinterpret Maimonides, but that he sort of twisted Maimonides to suit his own agenda in a way that he may have sincerely believed Maimonides must have meant, but that I think really does not align with what Maimonides had in mind. And he really turns Maimonides upside down and inside out, because he's basically is saying Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah is supporting this new concept of Kolel Yeshiva Torah study. So not only, of course, non-Jews can't be considered holy, and they certainly have no share in the world to come, but it's only a subset of Jews, those Jews who focus exclusively on Torah study, and deserve to be financially sponsored by the Jewish community. It's only those Jews, so some very small fraction of the Jewish community, that Maimonides must have been referring to in saying that they are as holy as the Holy of Holies, and endeared to God forever, have a share of the world to come. So let me show you how absolutely sort of inconsistent with the pshat of Maimonides this interpretation of by Rav Aaron Kotler really is, on just this small but important point about Torah scholars being financially independent. Maimonides is notoriously well known, even in the traditional world, for his view that Torah scholars should not be sponsored by the community. If you are a full-time Torah scholar in a Kolel yeshiva, for Maimonides, you are really corrupting the essence of Judaism. Maimonides wrote in the Mishnah Torah, one should ever patiently strive not to be dependent on other people and not to be a public charge. So too the sages have enjoined us, saying, make your Sabbath a weekday, meaning give up on having fancy meals on Shabbat, then be dependent on other people. If reduced to poverty, even a distinguished scholar must not disdain manual work, no matter how unworthy it is of him, in order to avoid dependence on others. And then graphically, Maimonides writes, one should preferably flay animal carcasses rather than tell people, I am a great scholar or I am a priest, provide for me. The sages have indeed commanded us to act like this. Some great sages, and he's referring to sages in the Talmud, derive their livelihood from chopping wood, carrying lumber, watering gardens, working in iron, or making charcoal, and ask no help from the community. Neither would they have accepted such charity had it been offered to them. So Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah clearly is saying, and as if he were talking to Rav Aaron Kotler in the 20th century, no, you shouldn't create a whole society of Torah scholars who are sponsored by the community. And by the way, this is, just to be clear, it's in contradistinction from teachers of Torah. If you teach Torah to other people, you can be paid. What Maimonides would have had a problem with are scholars who simply sort of learn for themselves and ask the community to support them in that effort. Not only would Maimonides have disagreed with that whole structure of that type of yeshiva study, but he certainly would have disagreed with Rav Aaron Kotler's reinterpretation that the people who are going to achieve holiness and closeness with God are a tiny subset of the Jewish community. For Maimonides, they were not only that opportunity was available not only to all Jews, but to all people more generally. Let me move on, and again, I'll leave all questions for the end. I'll get through the sources and then I'll open it up for questions. Continuing this exploration of Maimonides' universalistic attitude to Judaism, and I always try to show sort of what is the background, what is the lineage of some of these ideas. And again, I think Maimonides was in the minority in terms of the Jewish tradition with respect to some of these notions of the universalistic nature of religious opportunity. But here are two competing notions. Barry, if you can mute yourself, please. Two competing notions of the scope, reach, and audience of the Torah itself by two very important Tannaitic figures. So these are both, I'm going to give you two sources from the early rabbinic period, from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. From the first one from Pirkei Avot, the great ethical treatise of the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva used to say, beloved is man. It says Adam, so it could be referring to human beings generally, or Adam, the first person. Beloved is mankind, or the first person, for he was created in the image of God. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva does establish that we all, in line with Maimonides later, that we all share this common divine image. However, then he sort of narrows the funnel, becomes more particularistic in his presentation of Torah. He continues, beloved are Israel. And so beloved is man, but sort of more beloved, particularistically, are Jews, in that they were called children to the all-present, banim lamakom. Especially beloved are they, for it was made known to them. So he cites a verse that shows that they were beloved to God. Beloved are Israel, in that a precious vessel, a kli chemda, and by that he's referring to the Torah, was given to them. And they are especially beloved because there is a verse that many of us know that shows us that this Torah is a precious vessel. I hope you recognize this from our services. Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azovu. We say this as we are returning the Torah to the ark. For I give you good instruction, do not forsake my teaching. But Rabbi Akiva, just the sort of narrowing of the funnel, where all humankind is beloved because we're all created in the image of God, but Jews have a special sense of closeness to God because we received the Torah that was meant for us alone. So we received this precious vessel that non-Jews did not receive, and therefore we have this special benefit, this special privilege of having this beloved Torah that other people, in theory, don't have access to. Well, there is a competing conception of the intended audience of the Torah that I think is, frankly, I discovered this text in my preparation for this class. I was previously not aware of it. And again, I think this represents the minority strain within Jewish tradition that Maimonides later invigorates and gives greater prestige to. But this goes all the way back to the 3rd century, the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, a third, like Mishnah Avot, probably redacted in the 3rd century, so many centuries before Maimonides. We have here a quite radical, dashing statement in an interpretation of Exodus chapter 19, verse 2, where it says, the Israelites entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. The Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, again, a very authoritative rabbinic book, says the Torah was subsequently given in an unclaimed place, meaning in the ownerless wilderness at Mount Sinai. And this, again, this is quite daring. The text there says, for had the Torah been given in the land of Israel, the Jews could have said to the nations of the world, you have no share in it. But now that the Torah was given in the wilderness, publicly and openly, in a place that is free for all, and I've added the sort of popular way to think of this. The Torah was given in a no man's land. It wasn't politically or geographically owned by anyone in particular. It was in the middle of the wilderness at Mount Sinai. Everyone wishing to accept it could come and accept it. So this is a quite universalistic conception of the intended reach and audience of the Torah itself. So the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael in this passage is saying God's plan, God meant for the Torah to be accessible conceptually, in theory, to anyone who wanted access to it. It was not intended to be the exclusive possession of the Jews, even though it was originally obviously given to the Jews. But the geographic location of the revelation at Mount Sinai is substantively significant. What it indicates to us, according to this passage, is that non-Jews could also have access and are entitled to share in the bounty that is embodied in our precious vessel, the Torah. So those are competing versions of how universalistic is the reach of the Torah, what was the intended audience of God. So it really goes to very core issues about Judaism. And Maimonides was, going back to this passage, was more drawn to this version of the conception of the reach and audience of the Torah in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva's version in Pirkei Avot. And Maimonides was very open in a way that is both poignant and surprising to many traditional Jews. He was very open to both converts, to proselytes, and to the idea of proselytizing, to the idea of Jews trying to convert non-Jews to this wonderful resource that we have in Torah Judaism. This is from Maimonides' famous letter to Obadiah. I've used the Hebrew version of the name Ovadia, the convert or proselyte. The background here quickly is that Ovadia was probably a convert from Islam and wrote to Maimonides complaining about insults from his new Jewish rabbi, who told Ovadia, the convert, that he could not say certain prayers that indicated that God, for example, was the God of Ovadia's fathers, because Ovadia was not biologically connected to our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that was the first sort of affront to Ovadia the convert. The second was the rabbi apparently told him that his former religion, Islam, was idolatrous and foolishness. Maimonides notably believed that Islam was monotheistic in all respects. There were other problems with Islam in that Islam thinks that the Torah is a forgery. That's the main problem. And that's why Maimonides says, don't try to convert Muslims, because it's already a lost cause. They don't think that the Torah is good. So we have no interest in trying to convert them. It was also politically imprudent for Maimonides within a Muslim context to try to encourage proselytizing to Muslims. But Maimonides did believe that we could proselytize to Christians who still respected the Torah. And he believed that Christianity, by the way, was almost fully idolatrous. So we would be doing Christians a favor by trying to convert them. But Ovadia was insulted that his new rabbi would call Islam idolatrous. And Maimonides, both halachically as a matter of Jewish law and sort of as a matter of personal empathy in his response to Ovadia. So this is both a letter and really a halachic responsum, a Jewish legal answer to the issues raised by Ovadia about whether he could say certain prayers. Maimonides responds very empathetically. And it's a long passage, but I think it's worth reading together. So Maimonides writes about himself, thus says Moses, the son of Rabbi Maimon, one of the exiles from Jerusalem who lived in Spain. Interesting way for him to describe himself. I received the question of the master Obadiah, the wise and learned proselyte, May the Lord reward him for his work. May a perfect recompense be bestowed upon him by the Lord of Israel, under whose wings he has sought cover. So that's already a very a very laudatory start to the communication from Maimonides back to Ovadia. And he says to Ovadia, you ask me if you two are allowed to say in the blessings and prayers you offer alone or in the congregation, because there was some perhaps distinction between private prayers and public prayers. Could Ovadia say, our God and God of our fathers, Eloheinu velohei avotenu in the Hebrew, or you who have sanctified us through your commandments, that we saw that language earlier, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav vetzivanu, who sanctified us, you who have separated us, you have chosen us, you who have inherited us, you have brought us out of the land of Egypt, Hotzianu me'eretz Mitzrayim, you have worked miracles, you who have worked miracles for our fathers and more of this kind. So many of us are familiar with these liturgical phrases that were referred to Jews, in the sort of first person, in the plural. Can Ovadia, the convert who was not biologically related, who was not descended biologically from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, could he engage in those prayers or say those prayers? And his new Jewish rabbi told him, no, sorry, Ovadia, the convert, you can't. Well, Maimonides vehemently disagrees. And Maimonides was a greater authority than the anonymous rabbi who insulted Ovadia. Maimonides famously writes in this letter, yes, you may say all this in the prescribed order and not change it in the least. In the same way as every Jew by birth says his blessing and prayer, you too shall bless and pray alike, whether you are alone or pray in the congregation. And going back to during my first session, I really tried to convey the importance of Abraham in the Maimonidean system, that Abraham, as the first sort of converted Jew, he was non-Jewish when he discovered monotheism, that Abraham is both a role model and a paradigm for Maimonides, and via Maimonides for the rest of us. So Maimonides invokes Abraham too. The reason for this is that Abraham, our father, taught the people, opened their minds, and revealed to them the true religion and the unity of God. He rejected the idols and abolished their adoration. He brought many children under the wings of the divine presence. Maimonides describes that Abraham, the Torah does say that he and Sarah acquired people for their burgeoning community of monotheistic believers. He gave them counsel and advice and ordered his sons and the members of his household after him to keep the ways of the Lord forever. And it cites a verse from Genesis. And the letter continues, ever since then, so ever since Abraham's time, Maimonides writes to Ovadia, whoever adopts Judaism and confesses the unity of the divine name as it is written in the Torah is counted among the disciples of Abraham, our father, Avraham Avinu, peace be with him. These men are Abraham's household, and he it is who converted them to righteousness. In the same way as he converted his contemporaries through his words and teaching, he converts future generations through the testament he left to his children and household after him. Thus, Abraham, our father, Avraham Avinu, peace be with him, is the father of his pious posterity who keep his ways, and the father of his disciples and of all proselytes who adopt Judaism. So Abraham is not only the father biologically of natively born Jews, but is the ideological and spiritual father of everyone who wants to accept Judaism and the Jewish way of developing a relationship with God. And he says, you shall pray, Ovadia. You can say these words, our God and God of our fathers, because Abraham, peace be with him, is your father. There is no difference whatsoever between you and us. And he says, you can say all of these various liturgical passages that use the word us, for the Torah has been given to us and to the proselytes. And then this portion of the letter ends with what I think is an important and, again, sort of radically innovative conception of Jewish history. Maimonides writes, know that our ancestors, when they came out of Egypt, so the Israelites who experienced the Exodus, were mostly idolaters. They had mingled with the pagans in Egypt and imitated their way of life until God sent Moses, our teacher, the master of all prophets, who separated us from the nations and brought us under the wings of God, us and all proselytes, and gave to all of us one law. So this is innovative. I just want to highlight, because Jewish tradition, there are a variety of sources, but mostly Jewish tradition indicates that uh, the Israelites maintained their tradition, maintained their distinctiveness generally while they were slaves in Egypt. Maimonides said no, they really lost their way. Abraham had established monotheism, but it was lost during the period of slavery in Egypt. It was corrupted. They became idolaters. And it was only when we received the revelation of the Torah through Moses in the wilderness, um, by the way, in that geographically no man's land of Mount Sinai, that we received the law and then thereby received the truth about how we should approach God monotheistically again. So just like Maimonides is telling Ovadia, you are not only just like Abraham, but you're just like all the Israelites who experienced the Exodus and then received the revelation of truth at Mount Sinai of the Torah. Do not consider your origin as inferior. If we trace our biological descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people who were born Jewish, you, meaning you as a convert, traced your spiritual descent to the one who spoke and the world was created. And then he quotes a verse from Isaiah. One shall say, so one person shall say, I am the Lord's, and another shall call himself by the name of God. So arguably, and really incredibly radically, Maimonides is saying that you, Ovadia, the convert, are actually superior to born Jews. You can claim a lineage to God using this verse from Isaiah as a proof text. So one shall say, meaning a convert could say, I am the Lord's, and another, a born Jew, we only can associate ourselves with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in some way, by tracing the convert's lineage all the way back to Abraham and to the Israelites who were converts themselves effectively at Mount Sinai, because they went from being idolaters to becoming monotheists again in the mode of Abraham. You, Ovadia the convert, are like Abraham and the ancient Israelites, really more so than many born Jews who take for granted the Jewish tradition, but haven't made a purposeful recommitment to the underlying convictions about the world and about God that Maimonides was trying to endorse. So this letter to Ovadia is important, really as uncovering, as displaying Maimonides' universalistic notions about Jewish identity, about our shared humanity with other people, as being very open to converts, and about the nature of Torah and about our tradition as being, in theory, at least conceptually, open to the entire world and not an exclusive, insular possession of Jews. And the sort of radical upshot of this plays out. So that was Maimonides' his empathetic approach to a single convert. But I will show through this passage that I believe it really displayed Maimonides' openness to proselytizing. So not just to proselytes, not just to converts, but to actually active proselytizing to non-Jews. And again, he elsewhere says, don't bother with Muslims. They're already monotheists, but they also won't be converted because of their approach to the Torah. But Christians, I think Maimonides was open to approaching about the great advantage that Jews have through the Torah. This is from Maimonides' Book of Commandments, the Sefer HaMitzvot. So this is positive commandment number 3. So the first one is about knowing God. The first few all relate to our relationship with God. And the third one about Ahavat Hashem, the love of God. In a prior year, I taught about the interplay between loving God and fearing God. So this is a positive commandment to love God, right? The Shema says, "V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha," you shall love God, the Lord, your God. So this was right up there as a really important positive commandment from Maimonides. But listen to how he describes it. The sages say that this commandment to love God also includes an obligation to call upon all mankind to serve God, exalted be he, and to have faith in God. For just as you praise and extol anybody whom you love, and call upon others also to love that person, so if you love the Lord, and this is part of his sort of elitist caveat, to the extent of the conception of God's nature to which you have attained, Maimonides realized that not everyone has the same capacity to develop a proper understanding of God. You will undoubtedly call upon the foolish and ignorant to seek knowledge of the truth that you have already acquired. And then he cites the rabbinic book, the Sifrei, its interpretation of this famous line from Deuteronomy, Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, and you shall love the Lord thy God with all your heart. The Sifrei says, this means that you should make God beloved by man as Abraham your father did, as it is said, and this refers to the verse in Genesis that I referenced earlier, that Abraham and Sarah acquired souls. And Maimonides and other rabbinic interpreters understood that to mean that they converted people to monotheism in their homeland and developed a larger group of monotheists. That is to say, just as Abraham, being a lover of the Lord, by the power of his conception of God and out of his great love for God, summoned mankind to believe. So just as Abraham proselytized, so you too must so love God as to summon mankind unto God. So I think it's a fair reading of Maimonides' understanding of the third positive commandment of loving God. So just to be clear, Maimonides is saying it is a commandment, a mitzvah. It's an obligation to love God, and it should be an informed knowledge and love of God. But a byproduct of loving God is that you should go and try to find other people to love God, not just Jews, but try to proselytize among Christians, let's say, to try to bring them into a proper monotheistic understanding of God with the great facilitating system of the Torah. So let's turn to, with with Maimonides' universalistic approach in mind. And so whether you're a born or a converted Jew, Maimonides believed that you could achieve a high, lofty level of interaction, of knowledge, of understanding of God. And that's a result of our shared humanity with all people, not just with our fellow Jews. How do we go about cultivating that proper knowledge of God? Maimonides, the Rambam, gets very practical, very pragmatic in telling us how we should spend our time in sort of what could be called a Torah curriculum of study. But remember, for Maimonides, Torah is a much broader concept than it is for many traditional Jews. It doesn't just refer to the study of traditional texts, certainly not just to the Talmud, for example, but includes philosophical investigation that goes beyond the confines of traditional Jewish study. In the Guide of the Perplexed, in the introduction, and again, to clarify, the Guide of the Perplexed was his great philosophical work. It was addressed to one of his beloved, quite sophisticated students, one of those students who had sort of left Maimonides' their private study and gone out into the world, and they continued to have communications. And Maimonides really wrote the guide for that kind of sophisticated Jew. Again, he was elitist in the Mishneh Torah is much more democratic and egalitarian in giving common Jews access to Jewish law. But the Guide of the Perplexed is really intended for a much narrower audience. And really, the guide is meant, just as the title indicates, as a guide, and it's not necessarily an answer book. It doesn't provide black and white and fixed answers to every religious problem. But just as I've presented the way I think we should approach Maimonides as a role model, a paradigm of how to approach our Jewishness, and not necessarily in every detail to adopt his conclusions, that's how Maimonides approached the audience of the Guide of the Perplexed. He wrote in the introduction to that great work, the object of this work throughout, as of any other of its sort, is a sound grasp of the Torah, but he means that more broadly than the traditional conception of Torah. But here the aim is to instruct a person who is religious, morally, and spiritually mature settled of mind, and committed to the Torah's truth, who has engaged in philosophical studies and grasped their import. So right away, it's not traditional. It's not just, oh, study Talmud and then read the Guide of the Perplexed. No, you have to really venture beyond the Talmud into philosophical investigation to appreciate what Maimonides is trying to convey in the Guide of the Perplexed. He continues, human reason draws such a person vitally to its domain, but he is troubled by the surface sense of certain biblical expressions. Resisting what he still takes or was taught to be the meaning of its multivalent, metaphorical, or ambiguous words, he hangs back, baffled and perplexed. So so that you have something in mind about what Maimonides is referring to. He's referring to more than just this, but let's use an example in the Torah. When we read the Bible, the pshat, the plain meaning of many verses is that God has a body, that God has physical form, and in addition, that God has emotions. So there's very sort of anthropomorphic characterization or depiction of God in the Torah. By the way, to the extent that we resist that notion, it's really only because of Maimonidean thought that we say, oh, no, that must be meant metaphorically. But I think if we go back to sort of the original framework of the Torah, it's quite anthropomorphic. Maimonides tried to cleanse Jewish thinking in our understanding of the Torah of that anthropomorphism. And so, for example, Jews should not believe that God has a body and emotions, according to Maimonides. So he's saying the philosophically sophisticated reader of the Torah is confronted by plain meaning of verses that seem to contradict philosophical conclusions. Such a perplexed person, so that's the audience of the Guide of the Perplexed, is faced with two options. Should he follow his reason, reject what he previously took those biblical terms to say, and think he has shed core biblical precepts? So, essentially, should you follow your philosophical conclusions and inclinations and basically reject the concepts of the Torah and shed your faith? Or, in contrast, the second option, should he hold fast to what he took those words to mean and fight reason's sway, dig in his heels and resist, but feeling injured as though it had sullied his faith, retaining his fanciful beliefs, but fearful and uneasy, deeply anxious and troubled constantly? So in the second option, it's of a philosophically sophisticated reader of the Torah saying, no, I'm going to continue to embrace the plain meaning of the Torah, despite what I know philosophically, but that will just lead to a very unsettled, anxious, and unsatisfied feeling religiously. So Maimonides is saying both of those options should be rejected. Neither of those options is good, and the entire project of the Guide of the Perplexed is to provide us with the means to, as I said in the first session, integrate the rational enterprise, the use and exercise of our reason with Torah, so that they become a coherent, consistent way of thinking about God and the world. But beyond that, beyond that sort of general integration of reason or philosophy on the one hand and traditional Torah on the other, Maimonides is very pragmatic. And some of us, like sort of practical guidance about how we should use our time. Maimonides provides that practical guidance. But by the way, Maimonides was extremely productive, very demanding, and his model would be very hard to follow literally. But this is what he counsels. A person is obligated to divide his study time in three. 1/3 should be devoted to the written law, 1/3 to the oral law, and then 1/3, and before I read it, I'll just say this is sort of all of what I'm about to read is about philosophy. And 1/3 to understanding and conceptualizing the ultimate derivation of a concept from its roots, inferring one concept from another, and comparing concepts, understanding the Torah based on the principles of biblical exegesis, until one appreciates the essence of those principles and how the prohibitions and the other decisions which one received according to the oral tradition can be derived using them. The latter topic is called Gemara in the Hebrew. V'inyan zehu hanikra Gemara. But note, Maimonides' use of the word Gemara is not the same as it's used in the same way it's used in traditional Jewish thought, as we'll see in this next passage, where we'll see how demanding Maimonides, his curriculum of study is. So he says, how is this expressed? So he gives an example. A person who is a craftsman may spend 3 hours each day involved in his work. So Maimonides is saying, maybe unrealistically, try to work a few hours a day in your profession, but then devote 9 hours to Torah study. Okay, so Maimonides almost surely got very little sleep. His curriculum is extremely demanding, but the way he apportions his time in his advice to us is very interesting. So devote 9 hours of 12 a day to Torah study. In those 9 hours, he should spend 3 reading the written law, 3 the oral law, and 3 meditating with his intellect to derive one concept from another. The words of the prophetic tradition are considered part of the written law, and their explanation part of the oral law. The matters referred to as pardes are considered part of the Gemara. So again, that is innovative. Maimonides is saying the stuff that Jewish tradition thinks of as pardes, which refers to the sort of divine metaphysics, thinking about God's essence, are considered a subset of what he's referring to as Gemara in an untraditional way. And then Maimonides continues almost surprisingly in his radicalism. It says, the above applies in the early stages of a person's study. However, when a person increases his knowledge, so if you reach a certain level of knowledge and you don't have the need to read the written law, so you know the Torah well enough, or occupy himself with the oral law constantly. So if you've reached a certain level of understanding of both the written law, the Torah or the Tanakh, and the oral law, meaning the Mishnah and its commentaries in the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, he should study the written law and the oral tradition at designated times. So, once in a while, at the times that we appoint, let's say in shul when we read the Torah, you'll hear the Torah. That's enough, really. Thus, through those designated readings, he will not forget any aspect of the laws of the Torah. However, and this is where Maimonides is assuredly very radical, he should focus his attention on the Gemara. So again, that doesn't just mean Talmud, it means all the philosophical investigations that attend our thinking about God. He should focus his attention on the Gemara alone for his entire life, according to his ambition and his ability to concentrate. So Maimonides is saying, he's really encouraging fellow Jews, study enough so that you can get to a point that you know the Torah well enough, and then you can go beyond it to philosophical investigation that will enliven and enrich your understanding of the Torah itself. Okay, I think I'm going to end there before we get to the next, as you see this heading, the dynamic interplay of Maimonides and Kabbalah. That really will start the next session of our discussion. With that, I'm going to stop the sharing of my source sheet. In the next 2 sessions, we're going to discuss further why Maimonides was so controversial, why he was so provocative, and really understand this interplay between Maimonides' thought and the proto-Kabbalistic thought that existed in his lifetime and the Kabbalistic thought that developed following his lifetime, that he really tried to overcome certain mystical, in some ways what he viewed as magical elements of Judaism that he failed to overcome. Mainstream Judaism is more mystically inclined than rationalistically inclined. So Maimonides did not succeed particularly in his philosophical goals in trying to overcome those trends in Jewish thought. Those eventually really won out. That's why if you remember my first slide today, the non-traditional implications of his thought, each one of those, again, I think is a fair and reasonable inference from Maimonides' writings, but each and every one of those implications, I believe, is quite untraditional and quite radical with respect to mainstream traditional Jewish thinking in the centuries since Maimonides, and certainly in our lifetime as well. So I will end there. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to try to respond.
Mark, it's Ira.
Yes, Ira.
Could you talk to us about Yigdal? I never understood why Yigdal is hated so much in so many congregations, especially by Chabad. You think that you're singing to the Hail Mary or to Jesus Christ if you want to sing Yigdal in a Chabad environment. I never understood it until your class now.
Well, actually, I think you'll Ira, I promise you, I think you'll understand it better if you come back to my third session. I'm going to focus on Maimonides' 13 principles of faith, just so everyone is on the same page to understand what Ira's asking about. The Yigdal prayer that we say at the end of our Friday night service is a later popular interpretation of Maimonides' 13 principles. Those are not the literal words of his principles of faith. But the fact that Maimonides espoused these dogmatic views, and I will argue next week that Maimonides only really pressed on the first few of those principles, which go to the essence of God. The rest of them, I believe, over time, he thought were fairly dispensable. But a lot of Jews reacted negatively. Ira, this is perhaps what inspires some animosity about Yigdal. They didn't like the project of trying to impose dogmatic beliefs. And by dogma, I mean beliefs that are supposedly obligatory on religious believers. A lot of Jews didn't want to be told what they should believe. They thought Judaism is more a religion of practice than belief, and that as long as we abide by halakha and we do what we're supposed to do as a matter of conduct, we can kind of believe what we want. But Maimonides, just to be clear, did not accept that and rejected that, but I think failed over time. If you recall, and by the way, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the scholarly Shabbaton last year at Or Zarua. Professor Marc Shapiro has written a really wonderful book about Maimonides' 13 principles, but in that book, for hundreds of pages, he shows that subsequent Jewish thinkers disagreed with many aspects of those dogmas. And again, I think even Maimonides did not press the obligatory nature of probably the last 8 or 7 or 8 of those principles over time. But that's why there was animosity in certain circles. Yes,
Thanks,
Rabbi.
Mark, let me jump in and say again, thank you for fantastic depth thought about Maimonides' position vis-a-vis universalism, but substantiation that he really did commit himself, and in that vein, commit others to a pursuit of God. So you brought Rabbi Kotler, and I want to give you a chance to say how the Rambam might react, or how we could look at Rambam's text vis-a-vis movements on the other side. That is, we have humanistic Judaism that's come in our time, that's literally erased any reference to the Yud He Vav He Elohim or other language of God in blessings. It will literally take out any notion of atah, you as God as second person or God as a third person. It doesn't even relate to an idea of God in the history of the Jewish people. And 2, you have Kaplanian civilizational Judaism, where the human beings create the idea of a power that makes for salvation. So in the sense that there are other movements as well that have come, and we could thrust Rambam's texts over and against them, plus this kind of notion you just mentioned now with Yigdal, where people were against this idea of you could be a Jew and not believe, where really we know he was a deep believer and was leading people back to the well of faith. I just want to give you a chance to say how Rambam might react to all of this newness within our communities.
Right. So it's a interesting question, Rob. I think, yeah, I don't want people to leave with the impression that Maimonides, as Rambam, was not an incredibly traditional Jew in terms of the obligatory nature of halakha. So he believed all Jews were obliged to perform to perform all the commandments. I just want that to be crystal clear. But if people can just mute themselves while I speak, I'd appreciate it. But So that's a given, that Jews are obliged to perform all the details of halacha, and in addition, as an adjunct to that, Maimonides believed that the Torah was essentially a perfect facilitating tool for us to create the right kind of society, and facilitate the proper mindset for us to pursue the correct convictions about God. So on the one hand, halacha was an absolutely obligatory predicate for Maimonides for Jews, not for non-Jews, but we could proselytize and bring them into the system, and converts, of course, would then also be obliged to follow this wonderful facilitating tool we have in the Torah. But getting to your second point about sort of humanistic Judaism, I think Maimonides would have rejected very vigorously all forms of Judaism that tried to remove God. I mean, Maimonides was a radical Jewish thinker, but I've tried to make clear that the centrality of God was, he was maybe the biggest God lover of all in the Jewish tradition, that everything in his system derives from the ultimate purpose of our lives, which is to try to know and develop a relationship with God, and as we saw, to love God, and to try to proselytize to others that they too should love God. So for Maimonides, this is not my own view, forms of Judaism, I think for the Rambam, that make God absent as a focal central point of Jewish life and Jewish thought and Jewish practice and Jewish pursuit, I think would be anathema to him. He wanted God at the center of really everything Jews do and think about.
Mark,
Yes.
is Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Two questions, and Deb may have some too. One, you spent a lot of time on the Rambam's reaction and thoughts about Abraham. And given what the Rambam thought about Israel in Egypt, that they were following idols, not God, does he ever portray Moses as being a person who brought God back? I mean, brought God back to the people, brought the people back to God. That's a better way to put that. My second question is, I don't see, we're calling, or you're calling, or we calling Rambam a heretic. I don't think he's that unique in being a person who's proposing something new and radical, and therefore being an affront to the people who are in power at the moment. Is there any writing or any discussion on his political, social attack on power at the time, on the central powers of Jewish thought at the time, on the Ivy Tower at the time, if you will? And was he seen as a radical by that power center at the time, just as when Peter Mitchell proposed chemiosmotic?
Charlie, I understand. Let's stop there. So the two questions, if I remember them, I'll respond to them.
Right.
As follows. One is, the only prophet greater than Abraham in the Jewish tradition from Maimonides was Moses.
And does Maimonides accept that?
Yes, I'm explaining this. So for Maimonides, the only person greater than Abraham was Moses. Abraham discovered monotheism, converted people, but then his sort of influence waned through the generations of the slavery. And the person who achieved even greater prophetic perfection than Abraham was Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, our teacher, who was the vehicle through which the Torah was revealed. And again, the Torah is this sort of perfect facilitator of our religious and spiritual development and our moral development. So yes, Maimonides held Moses in the greatest esteem. He was at the pinnacle of human achievement. So yes, Moses was a hero for Maimonides. Secondly, Maimonides had an uneasy relationship with many other, what you're calling the ivory tower of his time. He was not a big fan of the leadership of Babylonian Jewry. As I mentioned last time, I think he believed many of those leading rabbinic figures held corrupt views about God, that of the kind that he was trying to overcome and that he likely failed largely to overcome. But he didn't like their theological convictions. He didn't love their style of leadership. He didn't love that anyone was being paid to study Torah. So he became an enormous social and political figure in the Jewish community who was, many Jewish communities sought his advice, sought his intervention, as I mentioned last time. The rabbi mentioned Moses intervened on behalf of Jewish captives in disparate Jewish communities in the world. So he became a very important social and political and also intellectual figure, but he was sort of a dissident within the system because he didn't have formal authority. Scholars may think that he may have become the sort of formal head of Jews in his Egyptian community, but the Babylonian leadership was very entrenched in a way that Maimonides was not particularly comfortable with. Deb, do you have one question?
Yes, my question is, did he ever talk about why bad things happen to good people? So that if you study Torah, you pray every day, you do everything that God is asking of you, but yet bad things happen, people see it all the time.
Right. So Deb, that's a really good question, a really hard question. Of course, theodicy, the problem of evil, is theologically challenging for all of us at all times. But my quick answer, I will get back to this in the last two sessions, but it's such a big topic, I didn't want to address it yet, but I'll answer quickly. Maimonides, that's why I said he doesn't have a warm and fuzzy view of God. So, for example, his conception of prayer is complicated because Maimonides didn't really believe that God intervenes in worldly affairs. So when bad things happen to good people, it's because nature is unchanging, and either nature is value neutral, by the way. So, bad things happen because natural things, unfavorable natural things happen to us, illness and the like. But also because human beings do bad things. I remember I mentioned that Warren Zev Harvey from Hebrew University was a visiting professor during my senior year in college, and that's what inspired me to go on this journey of learning more about Jewish thought. And I remember him saying, I don't think I mentioned this last time, but Professor Harvey said during that class, "Oh, God gave us a great world." And I sort of reacted. I asked him a question in the vein of Deb's question of, well, a lot of bad things happen in this world. And I remember Professor Harvey saying, the world God gave us was a wonderful world. What we human beings do with it is a different issue. And so the bad things that happen to good people are either a function of nature, which is value neutral, or things, as we know, that are a result of imprudent human behavior. It doesn't go to the character and goodness and virtue of God. Hal, your hand is up.
Yeah, two questions. One is, if Maimonides was alive today, where would he fall on the Jewish spectrum of sects or organizations, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and what would he think of the ones that he doesn't belong to? And the second is, who now would be considered the most famous Maimonidean scholar or promoter now? Which rabbi or which sect?
Okay, so the first question is easy. How he would come to Or Zarua, Maimonides. And I say that humorously, but I think Maimonides would find sophisticated, halakhically committed forms of Judaism to be very appealing. That's what he was trying to promote. He was trying to overcome blind commitment to certain patterns of thought in traditional Judaism that he thought were misguided, were misinformed, were untrue, essentially. He was trying to pursue truth. So I think that he would endorse any form of Judaism that tried to marry the pursuit of truth on the one hand, and on the other hand, a commitment to traditional forms of Jewish life, meaning halachic systems. So to answer both questions at once, I think he would find attractive forms of Judaism that try to achieve that marriage, which I think the best of conservative Judaism does that. Certainly, certain forms of modern Orthodox Judaism do that. Getting to your other question, there are a lot of great Maimonidean scholars. The rabbi and I just mentioned briefly at Kiddush yesterday, someone like Rav Soloveitchik in the 20th century, I think, would have embodied. He interpreted Maimonides, and I don't know that he always got it exactly right. I mean, people differed with the way he interpreted Maimonides, but the way Rav Soloveitchik of the modern Orthodox movement embodied sophisticated philosophical understanding with a commitment to a traditional form of Judaism, I think Maimonides would have admired.
Thanks.
Okay, let's end there. Let me just note my next session, the third session, will be Tuesday evening, May 13th, because of the complexities of the calendar generally and the Or Zarua calendar. So the next session will have to be Tuesday evening. So not next Sunday, the Tuesday that follows. And then the fourth session will be the immediately following Sunday evening, the day of the Israel parade, but in the evening. So this is the final morning session. But I thank everyone for joining me. We will continue, I think, in an interesting way, the discussion of why Maimonides was so provocative and controversial, the forces that he was seeking to overcome, that I believe he largely failed in suppressing and overcoming. And we can, through an investigation of those issues, we can better understand, getting to some of the questions that were just asked, we can better understand the varieties of Judaism that have emerged in the modern period. So thank you, everyone.
Mark, let me just thank you again.
And
Mark, let me thank you again.
Thank you, Mark.
thank you.
And let me invite everyone to join me for the next 3 Wednesday nights, 7 p.m. It'll be kind of the last hurrah outside of one last class in June, but 3 weeks regarding the sugya in Shabbat about whether or not God held the mountain over our head and said, accept the Torah or die. And so the sugya we will deal with, as we're on the road of the 66 most famous sugyas in the Talmud, the next one will be this very central Shabbat sugya, this passage of the Talmud that talks about Revelation. That will take us to other places in the Talmud where Revelation is dealt with. That's 7 to 8:30 on Wednesday nights, hybrid, both Zoom and in person. And you can always steer in for the newest sugyas. Looking forward to Mark's classes up and coming. Remember, the schedule is, Mark, can you just mention?
So Tuesday night, May 13th.
We'll do that from here.
And then
What
the
time?
following Sunday, the Sunday night as well.
Okay.
Rob, I'll just end by saying that's a wonderful passage in Tractate Shabbat. Everyone should go listen to that lecture. Maimonides would have, I think, responded to that. Maimonides was, if everyone could just mute themselves briefly, please. Maimonides was selective in the way he sort of approached rabbinic midrash. I don't think he would have loved that midrash. He would have liked it in the sense that we're obliged to perform halacha. But he believed that the Torah also embodied theological convictions that he wanted Jews to take on voluntarily and non-coercively, and that we should all sort of create for ourselves the commitment to understand those theological convictions that he believed were part of Revelation. So yes, the system is obligatory once you've accepted, once you are born a Jew or converted to Judaism, but the theological convictions that he believed were really paramount as part of Revelation, I think he would want us to not feel coerced into accepting.
And what I'd like to argue in reading the Gemara, always as we do on Wednesday nights, is that there are ways to look at the text as if they were, on the one hand, shot, simplest sense, where it might be that the mountain was indeed held over our heads and it would mean our death if we did not take this, and God was a threatening force and is for many, with awe and reverence necessary and required. And yet there are other literary ways to think about the very intentional metaphors and what it could mean that something is held over your head, in the sense that we as human beings know that there are requirements made of us and obligations that we ought to take on in a Kantian sense, and that the Sugya predates philosophical inquiry in a Kantian moral kind of framework that does ask us each to require us at Shavuot time, in addition to our daily lives as Jews, whether or not we should be pushing ourselves in a more obligatory sense, even though it's through free will, to take on the Torah, and that the rabbis aren't really trying to find language that is accessible, metaphors that are grounded somewhat or uprooted from the ground, in this case, a mountain that comes over our heads. So there are ways to read Talmudic literature that get us into expansive philosophical thinking that I think the Rambam would really love. Boy, would I be honored if ever he came for 15 minutes of a Talmud lecture, let alone, sit through a whole class.
Rabbi, I'll just end by saying I will try to arrange that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you very much,
Well.
Mark. Wonderful talk.
Take care.